Early in the war, the United States Navy possessed one of the most advanced submarine forces in the world on paper. But, in practice, their impact was limited. On December 7, 1941, as Japanese carriers struck Pearl Harbor, dozens of U.S. submarines waited tied to piers or patrolling under cautious orders that reflected pre-war doctrine, not the reality of total conflict. American submarines were trained as scouts. Their mission was reconnaissance and fleet support, not independent attack. The idea of hunting merchant shipping was considered strategically wasteful, left to history's pirates and commerce raiders, not a modern navy. So even as ships burned at Pearl Harbor, much of the U.S. submarine force entered the war with its purpose misunderstood. Then came the second problem, the Mark 14 torpedo. On paper, it was a masterpiece of engineering. It was designed to run at preset depths, approach unseen, detonate beneath a ship's keel, and break the vessel in two using a powerful magnetic exploder. In theory, it promised precision kills, but in reality, it was deeply flawed. The torpedoes ran deeper than set, sometimes by 10 to 15 feet. The magnetic exploder was unstable. The contact exploder often failed entirely. A submarine commander could make a perfect approach, set up a flawless firing solution, and land a direct hit, only to watch the torpedo strike the hull with a dull metallic thud, then sink harmlessly. Submarine crews called it the steel cigar, because that was all it became, a heavy, silent shape cruising through the water and accomplishing nothing. There are recorded patrol logs from 1942, where U.S. submarines fired 10, 12, even 15 torpedoes during engagements, and returned to port claiming only splashes and near misses. Some commanders quietly suspected sabotage or design incompetence. A few wrote furious reports. However, the Bureau of Ordnance refused to admit fault. They insisted the problem was the crews, not the weapon. That stance delayed meaningful repair and ensured that for nearly the first year of the war, U.S. submarines fought with weapons that could not be trusted. The third difficulty was leadership hesitation. Many submarine captains came from peacetime command cultures. They were precise, methodical officers who moved carefully, avoided risks, and followed regulations exactly. In practice, this meant long patrols with minimal action. Some submarines shadowed enemy convoys for days without attacking, waiting for the perfect moment, only for the convoy to slip beyond fuel range or into protected harbors. War is rarely perfect, and hesitation is costly. As 1942 passed, U.S. submarines sank ships, but not enough to affect Japanese logistics. Japanese merchant losses were noticeable but far from critical. The convoy system still functioned. Resources still flowed. Japan's armies in China, the Philippines, and the Pacific Islands remained supplied. But quietly, change was forming inside the U.S. Navy. You could see it in the tone of patrol reports. The language shifted. Younger officers began rising through the ranks. Some had studied aggressive German submarine tactics from the First World War. Others were simply men who believed that war rewards boldness. Names began to stand out. Dudley "Mush" Morton, who would take command of USS Wahoo; Richard O'Kane, Morton's executive officer, later captain of USS Tang; Charles Lockwood, who would soon become commander of submarine forces, Pacific. These men did not believe in waiting. They believed in changing the nature of submarine warfare. The turning point began quietly, often unrecorded in public summaries. Submarines started firing more torpedoes, with less hesitation. They began conducting surface attacks at night, running their boats like fast attack craft instead of underwater predators. They took their submarines into shallow coastal waters, places where charts were uncertain, and the seabed could tear a hull apart. They attacked convoys with aggressive angles, closing distance instead of keeping safe range. Losses rose, but so did results. Then, in mid-1943, after relentless internal testing and pressure, the Mark 14 torpedo faults were finally acknowledged and corrected. For the first time in the war, American submarines could strike as they had always been meant to. A submarine force once restrained, cautious, and frustrated was now armed with commanders willing to attack, and torpedoes that would detonate when they struck. The effect was immediate. Ships that once sailed in safe waters began to disappear. Convoys that had passed confidently now broadcast frantic signals to shore bases. Japanese escort commanders, who had once treated submarine encounters as distant possibilities, suddenly began facing them at point-blank range. The war below the waves was changing. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but with the steady, rising pressure of experience, adaptation, and determination. The Americans were not avoiding Japanese territory. They were now moving toward it, and that shift would soon bring U.S. submarines into the waters Japan believed could never be challenged. Waters they called untouchable. Early in the war, the United States Navy possessed one of the most advanced submarine forces in the world on paper, but in practice, their impact was limited. On December 7, 1941, as Japanese carriers struck Pearl Harbor, dozens of U.S. submarines waited tied to piers or patrolling under cautious orders that reflected pre-war doctrine, not the reality of total conflict. American submarines were trained as scouts. Their mission was reconnaissance and fleet support, not independent attack. The idea of hunting merchant shipping was considered strategically wasteful, left to history's pirates and commerce raiders, not a modern navy. So even as ships burned at Pearl Harbor, much of the U.S. submarine force entered the war with its purpose misunderstood. Then came the second problem, the Mark 14 Submarine torpedo. On paper, it was a masterpiece of engineering. It was designed to run at preset depths, approach unseen, detonate beneath a ship's keel, and break the vessel in two using a powerful magnetic exploder. In theory, it promised precision kills, but in reality it was deeply flawed. The torpedoes ran deeper than set, sometimes by 10 to 15 feet. The magnetic exploder was unstable. The contact exploder often failed entirely. A submarine commander could make a perfect approach, set up a flawless firing solution, and land a direct hit, only to watch the torpedo strike the hull with a dull metallic thud, then sink harmlessly. Submarine crews called it the steel cigar, because that was all it became, a heavy, silent shape cruising through the water and accomplishing nothing. There are recorded patrol logs from 1942 where U.S. submarines fired 10, 12, even 15 torpedoes during engagements, and returned to port claiming only splashes and near misses. Some commanders quietly suspected sabotage or design incompetence. A few wrote furious reports. However, the Bureau of Ordnance refused to admit fault. They insisted the problem was the crews, not the weapon. That stance delayed meaningful repair and ensured that for nearly the first year of the war, U.S. submarines fought with weapons that could not be trusted. The third difficulty was leadership hesitation. Many submarine captains came from peacetime command cultures. They were precise, methodical officers who moved carefully, avoided risks, and followed regulations exactly. In practice, this meant long patrols with minimal action. Some submarines shadowed enemy convoys for days without attacking, waiting for the perfect moment, only for the convoy to slip beyond fuel range or into protected harbors. War is rarely perfect, and hesitation is costly. As 1942 passed, U.S. submarines sank ships, but not enough to affect Japanese logistics. Japanese merchant losses were noticeable, but far from critical. The convoy system still functioned. Resources still flowed. Japan's armies in China, the Philippines, and the Pacific Islands remained supplied. But quietly, change was forming inside the U.S. Navy. You could see it in the tone of patrol reports. The language shifted. Younger officers began rising through the ranks. Some had studied aggressive German submarine tactics from the First World War. Others were simply men who believed that war rewards boldness. Names began to stand out. Dudley "Mush" Morton, who would take command of USS Wahoo. Richard O'Kane, Morton's executive officer, later captain of USS Tang. Charles Lockwood, who would soon become commander of submarine forces, Pacific. These men did not believe in waiting. They believed in changing the nature of submarine warfare. The turning point began quietly, often unrecorded in public summaries. Submarines started firing more torpedoes, with less hesitation. They began conducting surface attacks at night, running their boats like fast attack craft instead of underwater predators. They took their submarines into shallow coastal waters, places where charts were uncertain and the seabed could tear a hull apart. They attacked convoys with aggressive angles, closing distance instead of keeping safe range. Losses rose, but so did results. Then, in mid-1943, after relentless internal testing and pressure, the Mark 14 torpedo faults were finally acknowledged and corrected. For the first time in the war, American submarines could strike as they had always been meant to. A submarine force, once restrained, cautious, and frustrated, was now armed with commanders willing to attack, and torpedoes that would detonate when they struck. The effect was immediate. Ships that once sailed in safe waters began to disappear. Convoys that had passed confidently now broadcast frantic signals to shore bases. Japanese escort commanders, who had once treated submarine encounters as distant possibilities, suddenly began facing them at point-blank range. The war below the waves was changing, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with the steady rising pressure of experience, adaptation, and determination. The Americans were not avoiding Japanese territory. They were now moving toward it, and that shift would soon bring U.S. submarines into the waters Japan believed could never be challenged. Waters they called untouchable. Charles Lockwood did not look like a revolutionary. He was quiet, even-tempered, and unfailingly polite. Yet when he assumed command of U.S. submarine forces in the Pacific in early 1943, he carried a conviction that would reshape the war beneath the waves. Submarines were not supporting assets. They were strategic weapons. They could strike supply lines, drain economies, and suffocate an opposing empire without ever firing a shot at its battleships or carriers. For Japan, whose war machine depended entirely on maritime lifelines, this approach was devastating. Lockwood understood something many in Washington still resisted. Japan was vulnerable not at its ports or fortresses, but at sea. The empire's veins were the merchant ships carrying oil, ore, coal, rice, and machinery from Southeast Asia to the home islands. Over 90% of Japan's wartime logistics traveled by water. If those ships were sunk faster than they could be replaced, factories would stop, fuel would run out, planes wouldn't fly, and fleets would rust in harbor. Victory could be achieved by pressure, not spectacle. But to apply that pressure, 3 barriers had to fall. The first was culture. Submarine commanders had to be encouraged, sometimes forced, to be aggressive. Lockwood began replacing hesitant commanders with ones who had a record of risk-taking. Quiet patrol styles were no longer acceptable. If a commander returned to base with minimal contact logged and unopened torpedo tubes, he did not return to sea with his boat. The tone of command shifted. The patrol orders became sharper. Find, attack, persist. The second barrier was technology. The Mark 14 torpedo, still malfunctioning well into 1943, was an ever-present liability. Lockwood refused to accept the Bureau of Ordnance's denials. He ordered repeated live-fire tests using real targets, real impacts, and real data. When steel plates shattered on test ranges and contact pistols jammed under shock pressure, the evidence became undeniable. The exploder mechanisms were redesigned. Depth settings were recalibrated. By autumn 1943, the Mark 14 finally worked as intended. For the first time in the war, submarine commanders could trust the trigger beneath their fingertips. The third barrier was information. The Pacific is vast. Finding a convoy required timing, intelligence, and luck. But American cryptanalysts were steadily reading portions of Japanese naval communications, what would be known under various intelligence designations, including Magic and Ultra. While still imperfect, these intercepts revealed convoy routes, departure times, and cargo types. Lockwood fused intelligence with submarine patrol lines. Instead of wandering patrols, submarines began to move to intercept points. This convergence, aggressive leadership, functional weapons, and operational intelligence transformed the submarine force almost overnight. And at the center of this transformation were men like Dudley "Mush" Morton and Richard O'Kane. Morton was bold, decisive, and relentless. He believed that hesitation cost lives. Not just his own crew's lives, but the lives of American soldiers fighting across the Pacific. When he took command of the USS Wahoo, the submarine's record changed immediately. Wahoo no longer shadowed targets. It attacked. It struck convoys at surface level at night, with the submarine running on diesel engines, decks awash in spray, using the boat like a fast-moving wolf. Morton trained his crew to fire quickly, reset torpedo solutions rapidly, and pursue damaged ships rather than retreat. O'Kane, serving as Morton's executive officer, refined the tactics of approach, calculating angles, predicting enemy turn patterns, finding the narrowest windows to strike. Later, when O'Kane took command of USS Tang, he applied everything he had learned and would become one of the most successful submarine captains in history. Their philosophy was simple. Do not give the enemy time. Strike first. Strike precisely. Strike again. Surface attacks at close range were risky. A destroyer could ram a surfaced submarine in seconds. A single direct hit from a deck gun could cripple a hull. But these attacks were terrifyingly effective. A surfaced submarine was faster, more maneuverable, and could reposition between targets. Convoys that expected underwater ambushes at predictable distances found themselves under fire from darkness, waves, and speed. The Japanese escorts were not prepared for this. Their doctrine emphasized deep water, long-range depth charge patterns, designed to attack submarines lurking below. But Morton and O'Kane were not below. They were in the convoy, weaving between cargo hulls, firing at point-blank range, and vanishing back into darkness. As American submarines became bolder, they also began patrolling further into waters previously considered too dangerous to risk. Instead of lurking near island chains at predictable choke points, they began to approach coastal shipping lanes, the very routes Japan believed safe. And as intelligence improved, submarines were positioned not where Japan expected them, but where Japan needed to send its ships. It was here, at the meeting point of confidence and necessity, that Japan's assumptions began to fail. Fredo. Empire had believed that geography and patrol density made certain waters untouchable. They believed that proximity to home meant safety. The Americans now intended to prove them wrong. Japan's confidence in its untouchable waters did not arise from arrogance alone. It was built from geography, doctrine, and long years of naval planning shaped by experience in earlier conflicts. To Japanese admirals, the region surrounding the home islands was a fortress built not of stone, but of ocean, currents, and choke points. The Straits of Tsushima, the Bungo Channel near Kyushu, the narrow waters between Taiwan and Okinawa, the corridors along the Korean peninsula and up the Sea of Japan. These were routes familiar to Japanese sailors for generations. They believed that any enemy who entered them would be exposed, predictable, and surrounded by bases capable of launching ships and aircraft within hours. The reasoning was straightforward. These sea lanes were close to Japan's largest naval stations, Kure, Sasebo, and Yokosuka. Destroyers, Patrol boats and aircraft could sortie from these ports quickly. Japan maintained land-based airfields across Taiwan, the Ryukyu Islands, and coastal Japan itself. A convoy attacked here, in theory, should receive escort reinforcements faster than anywhere else in the Pacific. Geography favored the defender. Then there was the matter of currents and depth. The waters around many of these convoy routes were shallow, rocky, and irregular. Submarines preferred depth, room to dive, escape, hide. A shallow seabed compresses the underwater space into a narrow band. If depth charges fall into that band, the submarine has nowhere to run. Japanese anti-submarine officers believed that these natural constraints made the region a death trap for enemy submarines. If an American submarine attempted to approach, it would either ground itself, become trapped between depth layers, or be forced to surface under fire. To the Japanese Admiralty, this logic appeared airtight. To American submariners, it was simply a challenge. But the real weakness in Japan's system was not geography. It was assumption, a belief that safety was inherent rather than enforced. While convoy routes close to Japan were theoretically protected, the actual escort presence was often thin. The Imperial Navy was stretched across thousands of miles, fighting in the Solomon Islands, the Philippines, the Aleutians, and defending shipping lanes from Indochina to the home islands. The Japanese surface fleet was constantly in demand elsewhere. Carriers and battleships could not be wasted on escort duty. Destroyers were increasingly diverted to transports, troop movements, and emergency fire support missions. Anti-submarine warfare was not prioritized because it had never been considered central to winning the war. Even more crucially, Japan underestimated the adaptability of its opponent. In Japanese naval culture, doctrine was tradition. Strategy was built from the past and refined slowly. The United States did not share that mindset. American commanders, once the torpedo failures were solved and leadership philosophy shifted, changed tactics constantly. They studied the convoy patterns. They evaluated Japanese escort behavior. They tested new attack angles. They coordinated multiple submarines into wolf packs, groups that could encircle convoys and strike from multiple directions. Japanese escorts were trained to look for a single submarine. They now faced three. Japan also assumed that intelligence advantage rested with them in home waters. They believed they would always detect incoming American submarines early. But U.S. boats approached quietly, running submerged by day and surfacing only at night. Radar became a decisive advantage. American submarines used radar to track convoys beyond visual range, long before Japanese escorts realized they were being shadowed. Japan lacked widespread radar deployment in this period, and the few sets they possessed were often of limited range or reliability. And while Japanese commanders continued to believe that the Sea of Japan and the South China Sea were too dangerous for American submarines to infiltrate, the Americans were already doing the calculations necessary to enter them. They mapped minefields. They studied tidal windows. They analyzed shipping patterns and determined which convoys sailed on which dates of the month. The U.S. submarine force did not simply move into these waters. They prepared to dismantle the entire logic that declared those waters safe. Then came the escort shortage, a slow but irreversible strain on the Japanese Navy. As losses mounted across the Pacific, Japan replaced destroyed destroyers with smaller, less capable vessels, converted fishing ships, hastily built escort craft, and naval auxiliaries. They lacked sonar strength. They lacked speed. They lacked training. On paper, convoys still had escorts. In practice, many of these ships were symbolic rather than effective. Japanese officers sent reports warning of increasing submarine activity. Some advocated for a total restructuring of escort priorities. Others recognized the strategic vulnerability, but believed industry could replace merchant ships faster than submarines, could sink them. They were wrong. Japan did not have the industrial capacity of the United States. Every merchant ship lost was a wound. Every tanker sunk was a severed artery. Every convoy disrupted slowed the flow of the resources on which the empire depended. Japan believed that being close to home meant being protected. The Americans believed that being close to home meant being within reach. It was only a matter of time before these two beliefs collided. And when they did, the shock to Japan's command structure would be profound, because the first American submarines that entered these waters did not probe cautiously. They attacked. The first American submarines that entered the so-called untouchable waters did not slip in cautiously. They advanced with purpose, as if the ocean itself had been waiting for them. The USS Wahoo, under Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton, became the most visible symbol of this shift. Morton believed that hesitation was the enemy. His philosophy was simple. If a convoy was sighted, it would be attacked, immediately, aggressively, and repeatedly. In early 1943, Wahoo patrolled the waters of the Yellow Sea, an area the Japanese considered far too dangerous for submarines to operate. It was shallow, hemmed in by coastlines and patrol routes. A submarine cornered there had almost no room to maneuver. To Japanese planners, it was a natural trap. To Morton, it was a place the enemy would not expect a submarine to be. On that patrol, Wahoo encountered a convoy, merchant ships moving under the cover of several escorts. Morton did not shadow them or wait for nightfall. He closed the distance in broad daylight, on the surface, running directly at the convoy. The Wahoo's crew moved with practiced precision, range calculations, torpedo spreads, firing angles all aligned in seconds, not minutes. The first torpedo spread hit hard. Ships that were supposed to be safe burst into flame and smoke. Japanese escorts rushed forward, dropping depth charges, turning their guns toward the submarine. But by then, Wahoo was already diving, slipping into the uncertain depths. Depth charges rained down. The sea shook. Steel groaned. The submarine was forced frighteningly close to the seabed. But Wahoo did not break, and more importantly, she did not flee. When night came, she returned to finish what she had started. That single patrol demonstrated something the Japanese had not imagined. The Americans were willing to fight in waters where escape seemed impossible. Morton's successes, however, were only the beginning. If Morton represented the bold strike, Richard O'Kane represented the refinement of submarine warfare. O'Kane's command of the USS Tang would show what happened when aggressiveness met precision. Tang moved like a predator that understood every angle of approach, every line of attack. O'Kane favored close-range firing, sometimes less than 1,000 yards from a target, distances at which a single error could expose the submarine to ramming or immediate counterattack. But these close engagements gave Tang unmatched accuracy and lethality. Convoys that believed they were protected by escorts discovered that those escorts were outmaneuvered, outthought, and too slow to react. While commanders like Morton and O'Kane demonstrated personal boldness, the U.S. submarine campaign evolved further when submarines began working together in wolf packs. The Pacific was vast, but by coordinating patrol zones and sharing intercepted communications, submarines could track convoys more effectively and strike from multiple directions. One of the earliest successful wolf pack tactics took place in the waters, around the Luzon Strait, a gateway between the South China Sea and the Philippine Sea. Japanese convoys passed through here regularly, carrying oil from the East Indies and other essential resources. American submarines began positioning themselves not randomly, but according to predicted traffic patterns. When radar picked up a convoy, the submarines closed in, one on each flank, one trailing behind. The convoy had nowhere to turn. Attacks unfolded in waves. Torpedoes hit from one side. Escorts rushed to respond, exposing the convoy to attacks from the opposite direction. Chaos rippled across decks. Searchlights scanned empty surfaces. Depth charges detonated blindly in the darkness. The Japanese escort doctrine, designed to fight single attackers, could not adapt fast enough. Then came the surface night attacks, perhaps the most frightening tactic of all from the Japanese perspective. At night, a surfaced submarine had speed advantage. Running on diesel power, it could outpace most merchant ships and reposition more effectively than underwater. Americans trained to identify targets by silhouette alone. No lights, no flares, just black shapes against darker horizons. The submarine would maneuver into the center of the convoy itself, delivering torpedoes at point-blank range. In some cases, submarines used deck guns to pick off smaller ships and create confusion before slipping back underwater. These attacks were not just bold, they were psychological. Japanese convoy crews no longer believed they were safe anywhere. Reports began to reflect a shift in tone. Convoy captains wrote of phantom attackers, of torpedoes striking without warning, of submarines appearing and disappearing faster than escorts could respond. Some even reported being attacked by multiple submarines at once, a concept that had once been dismissed as impossible in these waters. One of the most significant demonstrations of American reach came with the entrance into the Sea of Japan itself. For decades, Japanese commanders had considered this region a protected inner sanctuary, impossible for enemy submarines to reach due to mines, patrols, and narrow entry points. But by 1944, American submarines had studied the currents and the gaps in mine barriers. They timed their approaches to tidal changes and used new sonar techniques to detect mine cables. A handful of submarines slipped into the Sea of Japan and began attacking shipping that Japan believed entirely sheltered. The shock in Tokyo was immediate. Ships stopped sailing. Routes changed. Fuel shipments were halted or rerouted hundreds of miles. Panic spread quietly through the naval bureaucracy. The Empire's inner waters were not untouchable. They were vulnerable, and they had been breached. The psychological cost was enormous. Japanese commanders had built their defensive strategy on the assumption that distance and geography protected them. When that illusion broke, there was no plan prepared to replace it. The convoys continued because they had to. The Empire could not function without them. But every convoy departure now carried uncertainty. Every mile of ocean was a risk, and the Americans were far from finished. The campaign was no longer about testing tactics or proving reach. It was about suffocating the Empire by severing its supply lifelines completely. The stage was set for collapse. Not sudden, but relentless. Not explosive, but inevitable. By late 1944, the effect of the U.S. submarine campaign was no longer measured in ships sunk. It was measured in what Japan could no longer do. The Empire still held territory stretching from Manchuria to the South Pacific. Armies still occupied China, Burma, and the Philippines. Airfields and naval bases still lined the islands of the home perimeter. But none of this mattered if the Empire could not move. A nation at war requires fuel, steel, grain, rubber, and oil. Japan's economy had been engineered around overseas extraction. Once American submarines severed these supply routes, the Empire began to starve. First slowly, then rapidly. Coal from Korea, iron ore from Manchuria, and rubber from Malaya once moved north in steady convoys. Tankers carried oil from the Dutch East Indies. Oil that powered aircraft, ships, trucks, and factories. But when the tanker fleet began to fall, the entire war structure collapsed at its foundation. By the end of 1944, Japan had lost more than half of its merchant fleet. The loss rate was accelerating. Every month, more ships were sunk than Japan could possibly replace. Worse still, the ships destroyed were not just numbers, they were lifelines. The Nishin Maru tankers, once critical for fuel transport, vanished from the sea lanes. High-value ore carriers like the Akitsushima Maru went down with cargo that could never be replaced. Convoys that once sailed with 10 or 12 transports now departed with 3, and often returned with none. Factories that produced aircraft engines began to ration fuel. Battleships remained tied to docks because they could not be fueled. Training flights for new pilots were cut drastically. Aviators graduated with only a handful of airborne hours. The Imperial Navy, once the most experienced carrier force in the world, began sending pilots into combat who had never flown a full practice sortie. Even the great naval base at Kure, the heart of the fleet, fell silent more often. Workshops sat idle. Machines lacked lubrication. Workers stood beside rusting hulls waiting for steel shipments that no longer arrived. On land, the effects were just as severe. Divisions stationed in the Philippines and Burma sent urgent reports requesting ammunition, food, and medical supplies. But these requests did not go unanswered. They simply went unfulfilled. Ships could not be spared. Ships could not be risked. Ships could not reach them. By 1945, hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers were stranded, cut off not by battle lines, but by the ocean itself. Entire formations became isolated garrisons, living off shrinking local supplies. Illness spread. Motorized vehicles sat without fuel. Artillery pieces fell silent, not for lack of guns, but lack of shells. The empire was still large, but it was immobile. Meanwhile, U.S. submarines intensified their patrols. The once hesitant early war commanders had been replaced or retrained. The submarine force now operated with a confidence built from skill, experience, intelligence sharing, and weapon reliability. Radar-guided surface attacks at night became routine. Wolf packs expanded. Coordinating strikes that cut convoys apart. Convoy. Commanders began describing the ocean not as a strategic zone, but as hostile territory. Reports from Japanese merchant captains in early TTs. 1945 carry a consistent tone of exhaustion and resignation. Shipmasters wrote of submarines appearing even inside coastal waters. Escorts, unable to cover more than a fraction of the fleet. Sailors listening for torpedoes as men once listened for weather. 1. Report from a senior Japanese naval logistics officer concluded bluntly, "The sea no longer belongs to the empire." But perhaps the most symbolic moment of collapse came when the Japanese Navy tried to preserve what remained of its precious oil reserves. Tankers were ordered to hug coastlines, travel at night, and make short, incremental crossings between small, defended ports. The hope was to outrun detection. U.S. submarines simply adjusted once again. They began patrolling the very harbors where convoys formed. They struck ships leaving port rather than tracking them across the open sea. Some submarines timed their attacks to tides, firing torpedoes just outside breakwaters and vanishing before escorts could respond. In February 1945, Japan attempted to send a final group of tankers from Singapore to the home islands. Escorts were pulled from multiple sectors to protect the convoy. The route was considered critical. Without this fuel, the Navy would lose what remained of its operational ability. The convoy never made it. It was intercepted in the South China Sea by a coordinated submarine group. Tankers erupted, burning their cargo in great black clouds that stained the air. What little oil survived the war afterward was used not for warships, but for cooking stoves in Tokyo. By mid-1945, Japan's industry slowed to a crawl. Transportation collapsed. Entire cities lived in darkness. Battleships, cruisers, and carriers, the pride of the fleet, sat motionless, their fuel siphoned away to keep a few planes flying. Japan had not been defeated in a grand naval duel. Its fleets had not been met at sea and destroyed in totality. The empire had been silenced, one ship at a time. In the Pacific War, history often remembers the carriers, the great duels of aircraft and flame at Coral Sea, Midway, and the Philippine Sea. It remembers the island campaigns, the jungles, the beaches, the cities in ruins. But the end of the Japanese Empire did not come only from the sky or the shore. It came also from the quiet places, deep beneath the waves, where no banners waved and no crowds watched. It came from steel hulls moving unseen, from crews who spent their war in cramped silence, listening, calculating, waiting. Submarines are not dramatic in the traditional sense. Their victories leave no smoke on the horizon, no photographs of advancing armies, no triumphant flag raisings. Their success is measured in absence, ships that never arrive, fuel that never burns, divisions that never reinforce. Yet the strategic impact was absolute. The Japanese Empire did not collapse because its armies were destroyed in the field. It collapsed because it could not feed, fuel, or move them anymore. This was not a war of sudden shock. It was a war of pressure, patient, deliberate, unbroken. A war fought by men who spent months at sea, knowing that one depth charge, one sealed hatch failure, one miscalculation could end every life aboard. They fought without spectacle, without certainty, in an environment where bravery was silent and constant, and the waters Japan once called untouchable became proof of something larger. No nation is protected by belief alone. No empire is sustained by confidence. Power is not geography. Power is logistics and the ability to defend it. In the end, the convoy lanes did not simply fail. They were taken apart, line by line, hull by hull, until the empire's reach shrank inward, and the Pacific, once proclaimed a defensive moat, became a corridor of American dominance. When Japan finally surrendered, many of its warships remained intact, sitting at anchor, engines cold. They were not defeated in battle. They were defeated by the absence of fuel, by the unseen fleet, beneath the waves.